what this is going to be over the next probably 45 minutes is a bit of a journey on what MATs are doing, what they're doing with growth, operating models around centralisation, is that happening? What is the systems landscape looking like? What are the challenges that MATs are facing with their systems? And then lastly, assuming you've got some of those things in place, how can you start maximising the use of your data? Because you've got an awful lot of it, and I imagine for a lot of you it's not particularly useful. So we're going to talk around specifically on that data piece. But as a sponsor, I get to introduce our company as well, which I'll be very quick on. I'm from Pierce Financials. I look after education nationally at PSF. As an organisation, we provide finance software and business critical systems to the majority of the multi-academy trust world, of MATs with 20 schools or above. We've got 70% market share and about 45–60% of all academies generally. We have the wheel of wonder in the middle, and I don't expect any of you to be able to read the individual components. So if you want to learn any more about those, we've got a big stand over there. Come and see us. But as part of our work, we've always worked from the MAT angles. So a lot of our experience is generally nearer the kind of top end of the MAT world in terms of size and maturity, rather than kind of the smaller standalone MATs. We've got plenty of customers in there, but actually a lot of people of those have a trajectory on the big ones. So we've got a lot of experience that we've gained from working with these guys. And I'm breaking up the presentation into kind of 3 core areas. It's probably standard management consulting speak. It's all about people, technology and process. People, systems and process. And the bit I'm going to start with is talking about people and structures and kind of operating models, because unless you get or start looking at that and start making improvements or looking to make changes on how people are structured, you can't really think about the systems environment or then the processes or the data. So, as somebody with a bit of a vested interest in sending technology, I'd like to start with the technology bit, but technology in itself does not solve your problems. So I just want to talk about kind of the steps that people are taking before we get to technology, because there's nothing truer that people leverage technology. Technology is not the strong bit, it's the people leveraging that technology. And technology enables process. And without technology you can't enable process, but without the people you can't leverage the technology or follow the process. So I do like that model. I nicked it from Microsoft, so if there's anybody here from Microsoft, I'm sorry, but I've credited you now, so hopefully that makes it okay. So first of all, there was a bit of a study done a few years ago, primary focus, that looked at the growth of multi-academy trusts, and with all of these think tank organisations, they come up with a one-size-fits-all approach, and obviously we know that there are huge variations out there. So by no means am I saying this is the model. This is talking about the growth of MATs from 1 school to 25, but we also know, school numbers is not the driving factor. Pupil numbers is probably a better indicator of where you are or size, because we've got a 5-school MAT customer in Cornwall that has 190 pupils. Okay, so according to this, they're on the edge of growing infrastructure, but actually 190 pupils, they're smaller than a full 1-form entry primary school. But just looking at this model, it does break it down into some phases, which are broadly okay. Okay, so according to this, if your trust, who's in a trust that's 6 schools or less? Okay, you are having an absolute holiday according to this model, which means you've got no excuse to kind of not make changes. According to this model, okay, pinch of salt required, but there is an element of truth to that. Nobody knows, I don't know what your current growth trajectory is, but if there is a ambition, and actually fairly well-known growth ambitions, that you're going to be progressing up this scale, it's a bit of an old saying, but the sooner you do it, the easier it is. It's never easy. I wouldn't like to say that any of this, or what I'm going to be talking about, is easy, but relatively. I was at a talk last week, and the technology director from United Learning was there, and they work with 70 schools. So they've got, I think, about 40 academies and 23 independent schools. He had a growth model the same, and in their eyes, they had up to 15 schools called the honeymoon period. Okay, so relatively, to run in 70 schools, 15 schools is a honeymoon period. For any of you running 15 schools, you wouldn't agree with that, but it is all relative. And so actually, the longer things change and the longer you allow things to run without potentially addressing structural issues, the harder that is to get there. And you can start to see there that line in the middle is the challenge curve. Okay, so it starts off in the early days, okay, challenge is building, but when you start to implement centralisation strategies around people and systems, that curve or that line goes up very steeply, and then over that period from 10 to 20 schools, does that curve start to go down. It works as an outline model. Obviously it's not going to apply to each of your scenarios, but actually it's a good thing to show to your governors, particularly if you're in that peak of pain. It's a good way to get potentially some extra support. So what models have we seen? I'm going to talk about kind of 3 broad models that we see within the maps that we speak to, and I'm focusing on finance because finance is generally the most mature of the kind of internal operating parts of a MAT, but these models do still apply to kind of HR, payroll, and others also. So traditional operating model, what we call the traditional operating model, and it's changing, but this is still the vast majority of the sector. This is still in use by probably 60% of the sector, okay? They have their, each school has their own bank account, and they predominantly, whilst they're part of a multi-academy trust, they've got pretty high autonomy, okay? So they're pretty much running how they've either always ran as a standalone school or as part of a maintained school. That is still the kind of de facto model in many cases, okay? We're seeing a big change. And you can see there that the MAT in this instance just picks off the statutory duties, so just picks off statutory returns, VAT and audit. Centralised is where kind of the end goal is, and whilst I'm going to talk about 3 defined models, the reality is everybody is somewhere in the middle, and there is no right answer. If you're hoping to leave this talk with the kind of the blueprint for structuring your trust, I can't do it. But the next phase that I'm going to talk about is centralised, which is the other extreme to the traditional model. And that centralisation starts with centralising the bank account or generating that standardised single approach to banking and treasury management. It doesn't cut out the school. I think in many cases, and I'm going to talk a bit more about barriers to centralisation, but in many cases there's a fear that actually centralisation means you get rid of everybody in schools, you just need a central robot to open the gate on reception. We're a million miles away from that. This is not kind of what centralisation is getting from. You still need transaction initiation in the schools. So whether that is purchase orders to say, I want to buy this, we've run out of toilet rolls, we've run out of pencils, we need to get a window repaired, you're going to need that at the school. Your central procurement team, if you had it, would not have that local intelligence. Generally things like petty cash and charge cards, which I'm going to talk a bit more detail on, that is still generally done at schools. Budget creation and monitoring, that's still generally delegated to the schools. Yes, there's support for the trust, but you can still see it's not just a token finance role for the schools. Even with a centralised setup, there is still duties required at the school, and actually is there and is required. There are variations of what that might look like, but generally there are still some pretty significant duties to be done at the school. And then the MAT takes on the responsibilities for the processing, and that means statutory reports, VAT and audit, pretty standard stuff, that. And I say the MAT, assuming there is a MAT and it's not kind of a CFO, could be the MAT in many cases. I'm assuming there is more than a CFO to make the MAT. But beyond stat reports, VAT and audit, we're then looking at those real kind of transaction processing, almost conveyor belt functions around month-end control account reconciliations, ensuring the accruals and the prepayments piece are done. Payment runs. A payment run centrally is, a payment run for 10 schools does not take 10 times the amount of time that it takes to do one school's payment run. There's a lot of rationalisation here. Budget scrutiny, and that can be as firm or as loose as it needs to be, but budget scrutiny is something that is generally being handed down from the centre. And then procurement, and actually negotiating along the lines of procurement. So this is where I'd say now we're at probably 25% of MATs broadly here, and I do have some data on this in a little bit. But there's also a hybrid model. There's a hybrid model in between. Schools do what they want and trust does everything. And we're starting to see this, and it all depends on the local context of your multi-academy trust. And we're seeing hubs and clusters. And the same word is used to describe or different words are used to describe the same things, and sometimes the same words are used to describe different things. But where we're seeing is a bit of a middle ground, hub and cluster, where we're just seeing a layer in the middle, okay? And that layer in the middle just gives, centralisation can be a daunting task. If you're currently at 20 schools, everybody doing everything, to suddenly move that overnight to centralised processing is a pretty big process and pretty daunting. A bit of a hybrid, either a step on the journey to centralisation, or because of the contextual makeup of your multi-academy trust, whether that's geography, whether that's governance models, depending on how your mat is structured, a hub-based model of operating may actually suit better. So it just adds a layer in the middle. Still the same task, but you're still not seeing a massive change of responsibility at school level. Transaction initiation, okay? That local knowledge being used to initiate transactions and still have some input on that budget process. But then that hub responsibility can then move towards that processing piece. And hubs can often be a roving accountant, a roving business manager. That's what we've seen a hub be. So rather than an office with 5 people, we've seen 15 school mat, 3 hubs of 5 schools. There's transaction initiation at each of the schools, but then there's 3 accountants, 3 business managers, 3 CFOs, whatever you want to call them. I'm not going to generalize. But then at 3 people and then doing this piece for their 5 schools. And that's quite a nice model. If going from fully autonomy to fully centralised is daunting and a long old journey, this can work along the way, and with budget challenges as well, it can be an attractive option. So those are 3 broad models on the operating model, and in reality there are 1,000, and none of our mats actually work to either of each of those models because there are variations everywhere. But where we're seeing some real traction now is around that budget setting and budget delegation model. So there's centralisation from an operating perspective, but there's also centralisation from a budget delegation perspective. So generally with all the mats that we deal with, it's down on the school to produce their own budget. There's a bit of challenge and a bit of rigour from the trust, but it's still very much an academy-led process. We're starting to see a shift here, and there's a few tussles going on at the moment with the EFA around kind of marrying a different way of budget delegation with a funding model. So a funding model that is very much school, 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 and depending on the funding model you're on, whether you have the ability to pull reserves, gag reserves or not. But the traditional model that I think 95% of trusts have, and it skews my very basic PowerPoint skills, is schools do their own budgets and there's a top slice. They might not call it a top slice, it might be an educational services grant or a central apportionment grant, but there's generally, do your budgets at school level and we'll take a bit for the trust. That's where 98%, 95% of all trusts are, but we're seeing a bit of a move to, instead of budgeting by academy, budgeting by division, so horizontal, functional budgeting. So rather than budgets being done at school level, we're starting to see budgets done more centrally, but on a divisional basis. And I'm not kind of giving a right or wrong answer on this. I think there's benefits for both and challenges for both. In terms of us as an organisation, PS Financials, we've got 7 offices. We don't have a budget by office. We have a budget for sales, we have a budget for development, we have a budget for marketing, admin, support, and so on and so forth. We don't have a London office budget, a Peterborough office budget that's broken down into those components. So, this model is not unusual outside of education. It's very unusual at the moment within multi-academy trusts, and in reality people are moving to a hybrid, but we are starting to see this, where actually the top slice becomes almost a bottom slice. So where I'm a trustee at a small multi-academy trust in Devon, we've got 3 schools, and I must admit it's quite easy for us because apart from the kind of founding school, the other schools are free schools, which means we've got a completely blank piece of paper, so I'm not going to pretend that it would be the same if we took on a number of outstanding schools, so I think that conversation will be very different. But we do all of our budgets centrally, and then we allocate a curriculum budget for each school for them to buy resources, learning materials, but everything else around IT, premises, curriculum, the bulk curriculum is done centrally. But there's some interesting challenges going on at the moment where trusts are really struggling. Obviously you guys know what's happening with funding. You've probably done your 3-year budgets very recently. There's some pretty big challenges ahead, and and some of these ability to restructure does give you the ability to really grasp that budget position moving forwards. But it's not for everybody. So, who's centralised? How prevalent is centralisation across the board? And I must admit, in the last 12 months, we've seen a huge shift from the clients that we deal with, both existing clients and new academies, a huge shift towards centralisation. And I think there's a perception that, on my previous slide, a lot of the big boys are on there. So a lot of the ARCs, the AETs, the Girls' Day School Trust, there's some big kind of household name multi-academy trusts. And I think there's a perception that a lot of those organisations are quite centralised, they're quite slick, they're a bit of a machine, and that is the case in many instances. But I think it surprises a lot of people to know this diagram here is showing the size of the mat. So along the bottom is the number of pupils in a mat, but that trend line in the middle is the number of centralised services by size of mat. So you can actually see that smaller mats are currently more centralised. I say currently, this is a 2016 report. Well worth a read if anybody's as boring as me. It's called Academy Chains Unlocked, and it was done by a group called Reform, who I think are a think tank type organisation. But interestingly, I think there is a perception, and certainly when I go around, people ask me, what are the big trusts doing? What are the big guys doing? We're seeing more kind of initiatives and more progress in centralisation at the smaller trusts, purely because of the level of challenge involved in making changes. Because changing a light bulb in a 50-school multi-academy trust is a big process. Centralising, restructuring is massive. It's such a long process that there's some real challenges at the real top end of the scale. So actually the smaller trusts are now getting ahead of the curve in terms of structure and centralisation and so forth. So the smaller guys are generally doing it more than the big guys, but it's still by no means the majority are centralised. And I think there's now general perception on the back office, certainly not on the education side, that around centralisation in back office functions is a positive. There has been a bit of a debate on that, but I think more and more now the perception is that works. So why isn't centralisation the norm? And there's a few reasons. A big one, it's still a big blocker, and a challenge that all mats are having is the conflict with autonomy. And I have labelled that perceived conflict with autonomy, which might be controversial. I'm going to explain why I say perceived conflict with autonomy rather than autonomy. It's about the right autonomy. Next one, fears that centralisation means they're going to lose your reserves. Big bad mat is going to take all my reserves if we centralise. Local objections to non-local leadership, that's a pretty big one, and I don't have any answers for that, I'm afraid. And mats are still your CEOs. It's your CEO's fault, all right? It's changing a little bit, but those beauty parades is come and join our trust, nothing will change. You get all of this stuff and you can carry on and do whatever you want. That's certainly changing, but there is still an element where that sales mode took place and people joined trusts on a particular set of promises, and that can be at odds with centralisation. And then lastly, and what's certainly holding back the bigger guys on this is, the larger the mat, the harder the process. So those are the challenges. How do we get around those, or how do you get around those? It's easy for me to say it. I'm hopefully preaching to the converted. You guys have to sit in local governing body meetings. You have to preach to local school business managers, local head teachers. So the trusts that have centralised and have done it as a benefit and sold it as a benefit, how they've done that is, first of all, so number one, single bank account is the biggest driver for efficiency within a multi-academy trust, but it's also probably the biggest headache and the biggest challenge to get through your schools. Because of, I don't want the mat to take our cash reserves, all right? That's the response you'll always get. Simply, cash does not equal reserves. Unfortunately, the mat can take your reserves whether or not you have a single bank account, which is the unfortunate truth. And if you look at your last set of stat accounts, your cash figure on your balance sheet will not equal your reserves figure on the balance sheet. So an easy way of overcoming that objection, the reserves point is a valid point, but it is not related to a single bank account. Single bank account does not impact on that. I don't want the trust to take my reserves. Secondly, starting to move some of those financial processes more centrally. I became an academy to increase our school's autonomy. I should be able to pay who I want when I want. signing the check is not the autonomy, okay? The autonomy for the school, with all of those school-based transaction initiations, is I want to buy my toilet rolls from this person. I want to use Bob the window cleaner to do my windows. Choosing what you want to buy from who is the autonomy. The payment part of that just happens, okay? The central payment making machine will just get that done. I get some teachers or head teachers like the ability to have their own checkbook because there's always a trip to a museum and the museum doesn't take any form of payment apart from a check. We get those, and the ability to be able to write a check is quite nice, but actually it's not a huge limitation on autonomy if you take away that ability. But equally, charge cards. Charge cards can make that ability to make your local payments outside of that big process machine. Lastly, trust-wide payment runs. No money is leaving my school without my head teacher saying so. A valid point. If it's coming out of their budgets, it's not an invalid point. The challenge is you don't need to authorise the payment for that process to be approved. In theory, if it's on a payment run, the process that should have been followed is at the beginning of the year, a budget has been approved. So a budget's been agreed that you can spend this much in this area. Secondly, a order has been raised, okay, and been approved by generally somebody who set the budget. The goods and services have been satisfactorily received, and when the invoice comes in, it agrees to what was ordered at the same price as what was ordered, and what's been ordered has been delivered, and they all match up on the invoice. If that's the case, there's no need for further approval on that invoice. By default, that invoice is good to pay because the budget has been approved, they're spending within the budget, the order or requisition has been approved, the goods have satisfactorily been received or the service, and the invoice matches all of those steps. There is no need for further signatures. We see all sorts, the number of signatures on physical invoices. It's just a non-required step if you get that process right. So hopefully that's given you some ideas of what's happening, and if you're tussling with centralisation at the moment, hopefully some answers. But we're really seeing the kind of the tide changing on this, and actually centralisation is now starting to be sold by MATs as a benefit. Come and join our MAT and we will do your back office stuff for you. It's really changed from the picture 2 years ago where a big part of academisation was autonomy based. I think the drivers for academisation, and certainly MATs joining, it seems to have changed. So it is an easier conversation now, but hopefully those will give you some ideas on what you can do. Okay, so I've done the people piece around structures. Moving on to the technologies and the system piece. I was going to get here at some point. I'm a bit of a systems geek and I'm a boring old accountant, so I was going to get to the boring stuff. So, systems. How then system landscapes are evolving to kind of keep pace, or perhaps not keep pace, but trying to keep up with changing to operating models. School systems landscape, okay, lots of individual systems at schools for payments, communications, tills, CPD, staff appraisals, absence management systems, MIS systems. We did a survey at the ASCL conference last year, and on average, schools have an average of 14 systems that they're maintaining per school, okay? And that, okay, is a challenge, but in a school environment where those systems are serving the school, that kind of works. But I don't know if anyone remembers back in 2010, then this thing come along called academies, and subsequently the growth of multi-academy trusts. Which then means, that school systems landscape that may have worked okay for a school is really out of its depth within a multi-academy trust environment. And I think we'll take as much responsibility, suppliers have to take responsibility in this. I think the sector is fairly slow in keeping up with the changes to multi-academy trust status. We'd like to think we're ahead of the curve, but there's still more we can do. So there's a school systems landscape that was there and broadly done a job. The whole structure of the system has changed. Okay, it's been 7 years since academies really happened, but in the last 2 or 3 years, the pace of that change has been incredible, and systems haven't kept up. And whilst there's lots of change and lots of growth happened historically, we're not seeing that tailing off in the future. So this is saying, okay, for those trusts, this was they interviewed a number of MAT CEOs on their growth plans by 21-22, and you can see Along the bottom is the number of schools within the trust, and up the side is the factor increase. So this is multiples of current school size. So this one up here, so this one here is say a 55 school MAT, and the CEO of this MAT says by 21-22 we're going to be 1.5 times bigger than where we are today. This was done in the same study that Academy Chains unlocked, but if any of you are working for a 55 school MAT and your CEO's recently been interviewed for some research, you've got some fun between now and 21-22. But I think the point of this is growth is expected. There's been a lot of growth, there's been a lot of change. I don't see that changing. I think it's going to change slightly in the volume and I think time frames, but there's a lot of growth still to come. And with that in mind, what that then looks like, that school systems landscape, when we translate that into a multi-academy trust environment, this is only 12 schools. I couldn't fit any more icons on the screen, but a 12 school MAT taking that school environment to a 12 school MAT looks like this. Okay, and if you guys can make sense and make these systems work for you and standardize your processes in this environment, fair play to you, and would you like a job, would be my experience. So that's where it is. It's a big challenge. You guys are probably in this mist at the moment. I'm probably not showing you anything new, but seeing it on a slide can be quite scary. So what are trusts doing? And I think there's kind of three general phases, and again, there's 1,000,001 places where people are on this scale. Autonomy is where everybody started from. Systems autonomy, all schools have done their own thing. We're seeing a move to standardization, and standardization does give a number of benefits. And I'm going to talk about kind of what those benefits are. And standardization can be, okay, I'm going for one supplier for all of my finance systems, one supplier for all my CPD and staff appraisal. But centralisation means we're going to use one CPD appraisal tool, or we're going to use one finance system, or we're going to use one HR system. Standardisation is an important step to get to. If you're at autonomy, you've got to get to standardisation, but standardisation, whilst some benefits are there, isn't the end. And in terms of really extracting the benefit and to kind of achieve your operating objectives, it can't end there, and it needs to go to centralisation. And why? So rather than me just saying that, I've kind of broken it down into 4 pillars of between autonomy and standardisation, what this will give you as a multi-academy trust. And these are 4 things. I could have done a slide with 20 points on, but I'll get a bit carried away. First of all, biggest frustration certainly in schools and MATs is the amount of duplication that's happening across all of these systems. So if there's 14 different systems on average in a school, and 5 of those hold staff information, when you get a new starter, some poor person has to update 5 systems, 6 systems. And because that's on them to do that, the chances of the accuracy being maintained and kind of committing to that process on updates is a challenge. So eliminate duplication. With standardization, you will eliminate duplication, which does have some benefits beyond just efficiency. Another kind of benefit and what people have achieved from standardization and centralization, beyond the efficiency benefits, there's obviously efficiency benefits if you can remove duplication of entry. But beyond that, by stealth, you can implement controls and processes, okay? And that in that Wild West systems landscape of all schools doing their own thing, you've got very little ability and very probably little comfort that schools are following trust-approved policies, because they're doing their own thing, and you've got no real way to see it and no real way to enforce that. So standardization and centralization gives the ability to really standardize processes. Consistency and reliability, a bit of a byproduct of the first 2, but by having one system, or at least a standard system or a centralized system, your data is going to be consistent across all of your schools in a consistent format, which naturally should then give you the ability to start relying on some data. I don't know your current scenarios, but I think the gender pay gap is probably a good example of how unable you are to rely on your data currently. Getting that ability, getting that data consistent, and then by default you can rely on it as being right. And then lastly, control, okay, which is kind of a byproduct of all of those and kind of linked to the ensure compliance. But if you've got 20 schools with 20 different systems, there is no way you can really give comfort that you've got control. Yes, you can have policies and hope people follow them, and if you get time to check if they're being followed, you'll understand that, but you don't really have control. And when we're looking at finance, just the ability to have control over the banking arrangements, we've all seen the frauds where there's been a builder's sign outside that's doing, Kia services have been doing an extension. The next week, the finance system the finance team gets phoned up and says, "Hi, I'm Dave from Kia. We've changed our bank details to this." Next week, £1 million goes out to the wrong person. By not having centralisation and not having standardisation, you're increasing your scope. You're increasing the ability for those things to happen by the number of schools and the number of times you've got that potential. If you've got 20 bank accounts and 20 people that can do that, you've got 20 times the risk of that process happening, whereas you bring it central, you can nail it down and you control things. Okay, so what are we doing? And what are trusts doing that's kind of driving this whole process? Our strapline is using technology to drive financial health and efficiency in education. Our customers are adding this onto their people strategy, because you can't do this. Technology doesn't solve this, and I love to say it does, but you've got to get your people right first. And there's some core areas. Number one, the biggest frustration we still see in schools, and whilst there's lots of benefits for a MAT of standardising and centralising around the control and the standardisation of process, a big win for schools is just to say, here goes schools, you can now enter that information once. Without any more kind of low-hanging fruit, winning hearts and minds jobs, that one thing is a big benefit for schools that actually gets them really interested in any of these change processes. Systems then drive each other, okay? And I'm going to dig beneath the wishy-washy through deep integration and revised processes, okay? Moving data around is step one of the integration journey that all of our trusts are going through. Step two is around starting to use processes in one system to drive a process in another. So at the moment, most schools will have a CPD or an annual appraisal process, and most schools will have a 3-year budget planning tool or a spreadsheet or a process that does the budget planning. I'm not aware of any, other than more than a handful, that actually couple the two. So actually use, well, let's look at the outputs from our CPD and appraisal process to drive our 3-year budget plan. Let's look at the chances that people could get a 2-point. These are really high performers. They're getting a 3-point increment. These guys not so much. They're not getting one. But actually using that process where you've got all your staff appraisal data to start to inform scenarios in the budget plan. It doesn't need to drive it like for like, but you can start getting better processes by linking together parts of other processes. And then lastly, using world-class analytics. Step one for you guys is getting your data in one place, place where you can rely on it. That is probably a world away from where many of you are. Yes, there's lots of exciting things you can get onto with business intelligence, but step one is getting it accessible and getting you the ability to rely on that data centrally. And I will cover a bit more around how people have achieved that. So then specifically on integrations, what are people doing on integrations? Unbelievably, the most boring part of assessing that integration landscape is really stripping back the business process and understanding what is the natural home or the natural master data for that bit of data. So, people data. It's thinking about where should that person data sit. Is it MIS? Is it payroll? Is it HR? And understand actually where is the most logical place that you would go to for that one source of the truth on that bit of data. So that's the boring bit. Beyond that, and actually what is quite an easy thing now within kind of modern systems, with APIs, with automatic web services, data transfer between systems is not as challenging as it once was. What's really challenging is if you've got 25 different CPD systems, you want to feed that different CPD systems, and you want to feed 25 different bits of data into one HR system, that's the challenge. But if you've got standardisation in your systems or centralisation, it certainly makes things easier down the track. Joining system processes, that's where I kind of touched on the CPD and the budget planning. And then longer term, actually redefining business processes. And we're looking longer term, and we're spending some time in this area at the moment. So we've got a budget planning tool, we've got a finance tool, we've got reporting. There's also a timetable process, and there's curriculum-led financial planning. That for us feels like a process, one process, whereas at the moment it's very much individual things. And by getting system landscapes in place, you can start to assess actually what should this process look like? How would we be doing this process if we did it on a bit of paper or designed it from scratch, rather than how do we have to do this process, because that's what the tools allow us to do. So that's a bit on systems. I'm waiting for time. Oh, not bad. Okay, moving on to kind of automations and efficiency. Who recognise that as their MAT finance function? Okay, it's a bit far away, but I think I read far too much of these scary things about AI and the robots that come and all the rest of it, but at the top of most of those surveys, our jobs are up there, okay? We're a long way from that. You know, if we're 5-10 years away from that in general population, by default education is probably 15 or 20 years beyond that because of the challenges you guys have to go through to make any changes. But there are some workflow technologies and automation in small components is already making huge changes within the space. So I just want to talk about how people are getting systems to do the work and just removing some of that reliance on individual people. So automated workflows, some kind of headline features on why people are doing this, and hopefully you've got some element of automated process going on in your organisations. But just be ruthless and try and automate and standardise as much as you can, because you will certainly get the benefit. Automated workflows, system driven, and you can centrally audit that approval process. So anywhere where you've got signatures, anywhere in your organisation, do what you can to root those out, because if you're looking at checking and enforcing process and actually doing audits of your processes, if you're relying on paper and signatures, you're going to have to go on site. You're going to have to go locally to go to filing cabinets and review signatures. Anything you can automate and bring centrally means that process is more efficient, it's more secure, but equally you can gain comfort remotely by auditing those processes. Dates, there's a lot of things that you guys do that are date specific, whether that is on anniversaries of employments, whether that's on probations, whether that's on reporting deadlines, month-end deadlines. Dates drive us all, unfortunately. And if there's things you're repeating on a monthly basis or an annual basis, the chances are systems can start doing that, because giving visibility of a date that's coming is pretty easy, and at least if it means that things are being done on time, that's something that's been taken off hugely. System-driven progression, so make the system fit your process. So if it's spend authorizations, people have 250 quid at budget holder level, £1,000 at head teacher level, £10,000 at CEO level, £1 million at trustee, whatever those processes are, workflows, stepped workflows and nested workflows that trigger each other, are not tricky. So if you've got slightly different processes, first of all, that means the chance of them being followed manually is even more remote, and secondly, you've got that comfort that they can be done via automated workflows. But it's all around that policy and almost being relentless and a bit obsessive on get rid of manual. Paperless office obsession is what our trusts do. If you can do anything at all, just get rid of the reliance on paper. We've got, at our trust, we've got Ken. Ken was a HMI for 60 years, I don't know, it's a long time. Ken's now retired. Ken was anti-paper, okay, on our board. Ken's now using a Surface, and he uses online ink, and he loves it. But I know you guys all have your own Kens or Ken's equivalents, and actually, it's a bit of a longer process, but we can get paperless, and that does then trigger a lot of these processes. I mentioned the ability to have cashless or petty cash and charge cards to get around that local flexibilities on losing that autonomy. But I say that in one hand, I'm going to take it away with another. Has anybody got rid of petty cash across their trusts? Yeah, very proud looking lady. Yeah, well done. If you can do it, great. From a risk perspective, getting cash off site. From a process perspective, charge cards now and business procurement cards. I've got Barclays up there. Lloyd's have got, I think, the general market share in education. There are some pretty slick solutions now on procurement cards where you can manage people's spend on the procurement card. You can also then get your Avios points. There's other ways of getting things back for the trust, but just get rid of petty cash if you can. Online expenses, who uses an online expenses tool? Is everybody manual in their expense process at the moment? Okay. Online expenses, that's doable. Okay, we've got a tool, but there's 101 online expenses tools that are out there. And what that can give you, it's a form of delegation. It's simple for the claimants. It's easier to use an online expenses form than to fill out a spreadsheet. They're designed to make it easy. You've got that electronic approval process ticked. You can enforce those policies. You can enforce your expenses policy. So if you've got a limit on £50 for a hotel, £100 for a hotel, if somebody does a claim for a hotel for £125, you can auto reject. You can start to build in these controls in your expense process to give you comfort that those expenses and you guys are not the next ones on Panorama Special on multi-academy trusts. You get your VAT treatment right. I don't know if anybody does the correct treatment of VAT and takes into account emissions and people's cars. A lot of people don't bother, including us, because it's an absolute pain to administer and the VAT you get back is a challenge. These expenses apps will do that whole process for you, that whole calculation, the emissions piece for you. And for all you control freaks, this doesn't get in or paid without you guys potentially having a say and giving the final green light on expenses. So expenses, online expenses, gets rid of a lot of grief within your organisation. They're easy to use and you can get rid of that whole paperless office obsession. You don't need to print anything, you don't need to sign anything. Just take photos with your mobile phone, tablet, any device, camera-enabled device. You can sort out that whole process, start to finish. And HMRC are happy for you not to keep these receipts yourself. As long as you've got paper evidence, it's actually on the employee to keep their supporting documentation. So this kind of builds on the next bit around delegation and things around procurement cards and expense claims. That is a form of automation, but all you're really doing is delegating that process. Rather than you processing manual forms and processing things, you're letting somebody else do that. And it's actually better because they prefer it. It's much easier to do an online expense claim than a paper one. It's easier to do an online overtime claim than a paper form. So you're not going to be pushing on a closed door with some of these delegated processes. But where we've seen loads of delegated, I've just got a massive list, and feel free to take a picture of these. These are all processes that we know in many MATs are very intensive in terms of labour intensive for you guys, very much open to inconsistency and open to people not following the process because that control isn't there. But these processes can all be standardised and automated, and just think what difference this would make to your organisation if these processes were just handled by automated systems. So around payroll, HR payroll, employee change of details, change of phone number, change of address. Just imagine if that could be done without any forms, just straight into the system and that's done. Overtime claims, consistent approach to overtime, get people to do that, electronic approvals. Absences, so depending on your policies, probably less than 3 days they should self-certify when they get back that they've seen a doctor or not. Above 3 days, line managers should be doing return to work interviews. Do you have confidence that those processes are happening at the moment and are they all being done in a consistent manner? Holiday requests, appraisals, CPDs, the ability to automate that process and make sure those processes are happening when they should be happening. Pay slip requests, people that remortgage, I need my last 3 pay slips, I need my P60. If they're anything like me, they've lost them, but let people do that themselves. Here you go, here's your pay slips, do what you want with them. Parents, delegate to parents. Looking out there is a whole host of systems that allow you to delegate things to parents. We have some very nice solutions in this area, but I would say that club and trip bookings. As someone who's a trustee of primary schools, the admin that is caused by those extended services, breakfast club, after school clubs, trips, we have a bus service, we have golf clubs. If we calculated the cost of that administration piece, we would stop them all tomorrow. We wouldn't because of the benefit essentially to the kids, but that whole process is an administrative nightmare, and that's just across 3 schools. There are some pretty good systems out there, particularly underneath the PSF umbrella, that will automate that process and allow that direct booking piece. Payments come directly in, the debt chasing is done automatically, and when payments are made, they'll drop into your system. And lastly, around finance. As a finance system, still the majority of our customers don't push out purchase requisitions to budget holders in the organisation. We've got a brand new version of our purchasing tool coming out next week on Monday to try and get that taken up more widely. Purchase requisitions are still done on paper form in most organisations. Expense claims are still done manually, Excel or on paper form. And then lastly, procurement and charge cards. There's some really nice solutions around in that area around essentially you can top up people's charge cards, they can then go in and code up their charge card statement, and that can automatically then pay the bill and be posted into your books. So there's some nice solutions there. So there's if you're going to look at, there's loads of things, but in terms of focusing on some pretty core operating activities that our trusts are starting to automate, that's a pretty good place to start. And I must admit, the hardest part of that is the parents piece, just because of the variation and the landscape. If it's hard getting schools to adopt things en masse, parents are harder. So it is a challenge, but equally, in terms of effort and reward, there are some big benefits to be made there. So lastly, assuming you've got your people all sorted, you've got your systems all done, you've got your standardised systems, centralised, all your automated workflows, what can you then do with the data? So on the data, I'm not going to go over this because I think I covered this on previous, but you guys are really up against it with data, but purely because of the systems landscape that you have in place. And whilst I'm going to talk about BI, in theory, BI tools could go across your 120 different systems, pull out the data and do it. The reality is you guys wouldn't have a budget to do that. So unless funding changes significantly and we can do that end of the BI spectrum, that systems piece has to change for you guys to have any use of your data. And how do we do that? How do we get that data culture? How do we implement this change? And there's some real key things that I add. Firstly, it's around standardising that system. Standardised systems as an absolute minimum. Even with standardised systems, there's challenges. If you can get to centralised, you're on the right tracks. Hearts and minds, you guys will know any change project is constantly hearts and minds. So get those early availability of tangible benefits. Entering things once is a good one. Self-service functionality is another good one. People will like you doing expenses online, like doing it, some of those other areas. Paperless office obsession. If there's kind of one underlying cultural thing you can do in your organisation on the operating side, paperless office obsession. There's the 10-year-old boy in me trying not to refer the acronym that paperless office obsession leads to. I lost, the 10-year-old boy just won, but paperless office obsession is something that can just really change that culture in the organisation. And then lastly, this isn't a negative, okay? Make rebellion harder. This is not about being nasty and being controlling and making it really difficult to not follow the rules. There's a positive slant to this. Make it much easier to do those processes. So whether it's requisitions, whether it is expense claims, procurement cards, those things are much easier than doing it the old way. And actually that's a real nice way of making change happen. And if the process isn't easier and better for the end stakeholder, then actually there's probably something wrong. And you need to really rethink about why you're doing that process. So assuming you've got all those steps in place, how can you then really capitalise on the data that you hold as a multi-academy trust? The only way you're going to do that is through adopting business intelligence and adopting a data warehouse of some sort. Obviously I'm explaining the PSF data model, but for you guys to be able to really get hold of your data, on the left-hand side are the variety of data sets that will be in your organisation. You can report on those individually if you want to look at individual data sets, but the real value to you guys as an organisation is where you can pull all of that data together into one place. So how we do that, we've got the data sources, we've then got an extract, transform and load process, which is a standard process with any BI piece of work, and that goes and gets data from the different systems. So you could see in theory that process could work across an unstandardized systems landscape, but it would be a huge process and quite expensive. But that then gives you the ability to consolidate the data. Because there's a transformational element within that ETL process, that gives you the consistency. And that also gives you data cleanse. So if there are still data challenges, you can iron those out with this ETL process. You then put that into an analysis model, and yes, there's a PSF analysis model. You'll hear of data cubes, data warehouses, analysis models. They're all the same thing, and all that is a massive pot of data that is specifically designed for reporting and analysis, okay? And you could do reports from individual databases, but individual databases, even the PSF database, that database is designed to keep the system operational. That is not, its primary focus of that database is not for reporting and analysis. Whereas an analysis model, and PSF analysis model and others, the only purpose of that model is to aid reporting and analysis. So it optimizes it for reporting. It calls things meaningful things. So I don't know if anybody's ever dug into a system database. Database table names are called the most ridiculous things, which means you've got no chance of finding the data. A data model is called things that you'd expect it to be called. Yeah, this is IT being helpful, okay? Analysis models that have fields that you understand, which therefore means you can interrogate models yourself because you understand the fields and the field names because they're in plain English rather than technical names. So there's an analysis model that you'll need to get to if you want to really start to maximize the benefit from all of the data that you hold. And once you've got that data model, this bit is the clever bit, unfortunately. This bit is the pretty bit, the front end of that data, whether that's Power BI, whether that's ClickView, whether that's Tableau. There's loads of tools that you can then present data with, but unless you get this bit right, the data model, your tools are going to be working at a challenge because they cannot fix data problems. They do the pretty stuff, and actually what sells BI is the pretty stuff, but unfortunately the boring bit here is the important bit if you're going to make the most of your data. And then assuming you've done this and you've got your own data model, you're extracting data sets from all of your databases, kind of the so what? The so what? Well, first up, you've got one reliable data set that you can rely on for all of your operational and non-operational reporting. So this can span educational data as well. Because it's in a data model that's specifically designed for reporting and it's been given sensible names, you can self-service BI. That means you can design your own reports. You're not reliant on providers, developers, consultants to write reports. It's designed, that model is designed for you guys to interrogate that, and you can do that via Power BI, Excel, Tableau. That data is now naturally combined, so you've started to now combine all of those individual data sets, finance, procurement, HR, MIS, students, CPD. So you can start then interrelate things. And the nice thing for you guys, or a challenge that you guys have, as a growing multi-academy trusts, your data is ever growing, and also your stakeholder groups are growing. So you're having to, at 20 schools, you've got a whole variety of stakeholders, from kind of class-based stakeholders to trustees and heads of finance committees. You have to present that data differently to each of those sets, which if you're relying on reports that you've got to write yourself, you can't do that. If you can do your own ability to kind of focus on key data at a detailed level, granular level, or a summarized level, you can choose how you present the same data to those different stakeholders. The nice thing about multiple data sets is you can start to really triangulate data. I imagine a number of you understand your core staff data. You probably understand your timetable in schools and the staff deployment, and you probably, maybe not you guys, but within your organizations, you understand pupil outcomes. By having those three data sets together, you can then start to correlate and triangulate these data sets to really understand performance. And that's a fairly standard example of triangulating three data sets that are probably individual at the moment. But assuming you get to the stage where all of this data is in there, you can then start to correlate any of these. So a really nice example is Pierce Financials. We will show you how much you've spent on training per school, okay? And that will give you a number. And the only real performance analysis you have on that is it higher or lower than the budget? And is it more or less than last year? That's kind of all you can really gauge from how much have they spent on training. But if you couple that with the HR system, you can then start to say, okay, well, has that training cost been spent on very few expensive courses or loads of really cheap courses? So you start to understand that headline figure. And then equally, you can then start to see, okay, well, what impact does that add on staff retention? We can start triangulating those data fields because it's all in the one pot. Data warehousing, the challenge that you guys have, I mentioned it briefly earlier, but around the huge variety of stakeholders you have, means you have to present data very differently. You cannot present data to a local governing body in the same format you're going to present 20 schools worth of data to the trust board, because it will just get lost in translation. You need to think about how you can draw attention to the important bits. Let's look at what sorts of analysis you guys can do if you can standardise your systems and pull it all into the middle. You can see your recruitment position. You can see how much you've got outstanding. You can see what vacancies are within X days of closing and how many applicants have we got against each of those vacancies. We can see who's always off on a Monday or who's always off on a Friday, or we can see who's always off for the same date more than 2 years in a row. So you start to see when husbands' birthdays are, wives' birthdays, but it's some nice analysis that you've got from having it there. You can start doing succession planning. You can see who is approaching retirement and actually who's then got the qualifications to potentially replace those, and in what geographical area those people are that are retiring, and equally those people that have the relevant qualifications to succeed them, where are they based? And probably very fresh in your minds, gender pay gap. You can start doing that out of the box. But by getting hold of your data, I don't know what processes you guys went through to get to your gender pay gap score. The chances are there's probably some manual work involved. And what it doesn't give you the ability to do then is actually tell the story underlying the data pay gap. So you've got a headline, gender pay gap scores, but there is a whole load of reasons that contribute to that score. And by having access to that data and not having to do it manually, you can start to interrogate that at employee group level, at school level, at age group level. It just allows you to put the narrative on some of those things. Thanks for listening, happy to take any questions, and sorry for keeping you for an hour.